Sir, in your interesting account of the restoration of the banqueting hall at Eltham Palace, you omit to state that, in order to provide the tenant with a modern mansion, three distinguished architects united their taste and intelligence to destroy one of the most beautiful things remaining in the neighbourhood of London. In its kind, I'm tempted to say the most beautiful. Knowing it to be Crown property, I had always supposed that it was out of all danger, and I've often taken visitors to Eltham to enjoy their delight at the picture before them when they came to the bridge over the moat, flanked by the two groups of buildings of no historic or architectural interest, which have now been destroyed, and with them the whole charm of the scene. The other day, turning aside to see it once more, I found myself confronted with what at first I took to be an admirably designed, but unfortunately sighted, cigarette factory. A native enlightened me and added, with emphasis, "We liked it better as it was," an opinion in which, if you were to publish photographs of the scene as it was and how it has become, I think the public would heartily concur. Yours faithfully, G.M. Young.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and thank you for that, Geoff. That was very well read. I mean, listeners, sorry, we normally have to do several takes of those quotes at the start because they're quite tricky. But you nailed that, Geoff. I'm very impressed.
Well, luckily, this time it wasn't a quote from the 17th or 18th century, so it was a little bit easier to pronounce the words.
The 17th century ones are the worst. But tell me, so that letter to the Times from 1936, how does that relate to today's? Well, it relates to today's subject in that we're doing Eltham Palace, aren't we, Geoff?
We are, yeah.
What's the sort of? Can you unpack that slightly for us?
Yes. So we'll go through the history of Eltham Palace, but essentially, it's on the outskirts of London. It's sort of within the suburbs of London, and that letter was a historian, George Young, criticising the work done by the Courtauld family to Eltham Palace when they bought the lease in the 1930s. And so we'll get to the Courtaulds, but Eltham Palace is a very historic, I suppose, originally medieval royal palace that was totally transformed in the 1930s to the dismay of many architectural historians. I wonder where you and I would fall, Rory, if we were living in the 1930s, whether we would fall in favour or against.
I would definitely fall in favour.
Well, I would too, if I would say that now, but I think I suppose it depends on if at the time I'm a stickler for tradition like I am now. You know,
the funny thing about you political quacks is that sometimes you're actually very pro-modernism as well as we've seen in history.
Well, I've always loved Art Deco, and we'll talk about that because I think there's something particularly magical about that. I think maybe it's because I'm an Agatha Christie lover and all those Poirot documentaries. But let's not run ahead of ourselves.
Yes, let's not reveal too much. Okay, so let's start as ever at the start because it's quite a complicated story. Eltham Palace is a palace. So can you talk to me about how it was founded, its early royal period, what it was used for, all that jazz?
Yeah, so we've talked in the past on this podcast about how a house can become a palace, and we've established that Blenheim is the only non-royal, non-ecclesiastical palace in England because it was a special exception, whereas historically exactly that, palaces usually were either bishops' palaces or royal palaces, and Eltham was the latter. It was a royal palace. Originally traces its history back to the 13th century when it was a manor, but it was gifted by the Bishop of Durham. I mean, again, it's strange, the Bishop of Durham owning property near London, but this is how it's always been. I think the Bishop of Winchester had land on the South Bank or something as well. I mean, it's extraordinary. But Anthony Beck, who was the Bishop of Durham, gifted the estate to King Edward II, and that's when it became a royal residence. And that was sort of in the early 14th century. And it basically, the reason why it was so significant and why it became such a popular royal palace was because of its location. So near to London, but in the countryside. We've talked a lot about these great houses that were sort of weekend villas, the likes of Sion or Kenwood. And Eltham, I suppose, fell into that. It was sort of far enough away from London that it felt like you're in the middle of the countryside, but
still close enough. Yeah,
but still close enough.
Was it a hunting lodge?
It was a hunting lodge. Yeah. So originally it was a hunting lodge within this vast hunting ground.
Right.
And it was really it was a sort of weekend pleasure palace for the monarchs to get out of London. Like Windsor, I suppose, similar, a bit even closer to London than Windsor, but exactly a sort of weekend place to hunt and do all the fun things that kings in the 15th century like to do.
Roar loudly and behave like Falstaff. Yes, very good.
Swans and geese and everything like that.
Horrible. Swan is absolutely disgusting. I don't envy them.
Yeah, and it's also quite strategic because it is on a hill and so it overlooked the surrounding countryside, which meant it was also not only a beautiful sight, but it was also in that sense, and the days when Britain was still ravaged by war, it was sort of a strategic position where they could have a lovely sort of pleasure palace that was where if enemies were approaching, you could see them from some way off. So it was quite strategic in that sense.
Okay, so up to Henry VIII, which monarchs were mainly associated with this palace? Who used it?
Edward III is perhaps most closely associated, sort of pre-Henry VIII. I mean, all the kings really up until Henry VIII used it. So Edward III, yeah, it was a really significant royal palace. So Edward III visited a lot and used to host tournaments in the grounds. I imagine from that it was sort of jousting and all sorts of other fun things that they did.
I have to interrupt you there, Geoff, because I have just finished watching. It's very embarrassing to admit this to listeners, but I've just finished watching A Knight's Tale.
Wonderful.
Which is just fantastic. I thought it was, for the first 10 minutes, I thought this looks like complete bollocks. And then the character Geoffrey Chaucer arrived, and I thought, this is absolutely fantastic.
Well, you'll laugh at this. When A Knight's Tale came out, it came out when I was at prep school, just going into senior school. And it was the first time people had come across Chaucer. And of course, Geoffrey has the same spelling as me. And so my nickname at school became Chaucer.
That's a very bright day. I'm so glad to hear that. That's
Geoffrey with a G, like Geoffrey Chaucer. Exactly. It was brilliant. I mean, I wish I could say I wrote like him, but
lucky on you. That's very good.
So Edward III hosted these extraordinary tournaments and feasts. And then it reached its sort of medieval zenith, I suppose, under Richard II in the late 14th century. And it was at this point that Richard II, it was enlarged. So he embellished it, he enlarged the site, he constructed royal apartments, and he built the Great Hall, which we will talk about a lot over the course of this episode because that's still standing. So he built the Great Hall, that was Richard II. And really, it's still one of the finest examples of medieval architecture still standing in Britain today.
Yeah.
And then it was used successively by Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. For again, business and leisure. It was a place to, meet politicians and, barons and all that sort of stuff. And it was used as a place for hunting. And actually the last great sort of medieval work that was done to it was under Edward IV in the late 15th century, who sort of completed the Great Hall that Richard II had started and undertook an even bigger expansion of the site. So it was a really impressive. I mean, there are so many of these extraordinary sort of medieval palaces that are so, I suppose, insignificant or even non-existent now. You think about those. What was that famous one of Henry VIII's that was demolished? I'm trying to remember.
The palace. What, Nonsuch?
Nonsuch, yeah, Nonsuch. I mean, it doesn't even exist anymore, and yet it was probably the greatest palace in England, wasn't it? At one point,
it was considered to be amazing. So Westminster, it's a smaller version of Westminster Hall, but not much smaller. I mean, it's an absolutely massive hammer beam medieval space. It's really long. It's got huge windows. It's very light. It's the kind of place you can imagine extraordinary entertainments in it. Kind of, you've got your sort of all those lovely people holding in multicolored tights playing lutes, and people jumping out of pies and juggling, and it's just you can totally imagine a sort of a late medieval ball.
When you look up at it, I mean, it's I think it was the 1470s it was sort of completed, and it is just, I mean, it's like the sort of cobweb almost of oak beams, isn't it? Just
yes, that's a lovely description. Exactly.
It's really, really impressive, and the height, I suppose. And actually, I think at one point people believe it could have been gilded, or at least partly gilded. So, I mean, really quite impressive when it was built. And there's also, I mean, the funny thing is, it's hard to tell what was original and what wasn't, because the roof was restored significantly in the 20th century, and a minstrel's gallery was added, which is not original. You look at it and you think it's a medieval hall, and it's got a minstrel gallery that must be original, but that was actually added in the 1930s. So yeah, I mean, it is. So really, when Edward IV sort of finished that hammer beam roof, it sort of reached its sort of peak as a royal residence.
Yeah.
Sort of in during the Tudor period, and that's sort of what we'll sort of move on to.
I think as a final word on it, I think one of the things I find so amazing about those medieval halls, and you've got a few of them as well at Hampton Court. You've got the I mean, I don't know how original they are, but you've got some of the sort of Oxbridge. You've got the what's it called again? I can't remember, the hall in Christchurch and places like that. There's an amazing sort of contrast between the walls are very plain, and you get these really and the windows are very plain as well. At the moment they don't have any stained glass in them. But then you've got the contrast between that rather empty lower space and, as you said, that cobweb above, that really intricate ceiling. And it makes for and it's also symmetrical. So although it's very Gothic, not Gothic, it's, I suppose, whatever, it's Renaissance, it does make for a very, very satisfying space. It's very light, very simple.
It's lovely. I wonder, I mean, it was never an ecclesiastical building, so it might never have had stained glass, but I do find it interesting when you go to churches that have enormous windows that were once stained, and then during the English Reformation, they tore out the stained glass and put in clear glass. It is wonderful how these buildings, these medieval buildings, can be flooded with light because the windows are so. I remember going to one church in Somerset, North Cadbury, which has got a lovely house we need to do at some point, North Cadbury Court. But the church next door, again, these enormous windows that were once stained glass and very dark, after the English Reformation, just replaced with these huge, big panes, and it's so light and bright. I mean, it's lovely when you're in a building like the Great Hall at Eltham, where the ceiling is so dark, and yet the wood is sort of lit up by these vast windows. It's sort of we associate medieval buildings with being dingy, but they're not always.
You're right. Yeah, that's good. That's a fair comment. Yeah, absolutely.
And then it sort of leads to really why Eltham's so famous.
So tell me, so what happens next? So we have the sort of Henry VIII and all of them.
Well, Henry VIII is where we're getting to. So yeah, it was Edward IV finished the building. Then it was really during the Tudor period. So Henry VII, famously Henry VIII's father, who sort of united the houses of Lancaster and York. For our listeners' sake, they sort of ended the Wars of the Roses, sort of united the great families in Britain under one crown. And Henry VII used to go there a lot for Christmas, for his Christmases, actually. He used to host his Christmas festivities and parties at Eltham. And it was his son, Henry VIII, who perhaps made Eltham most famous, because Henry VIII spent most of his childhood at Eltham. And it was particularly the site for his education. So at Eltham, he received the classic sort of princely education.
Domestic abuse from the VIII.
Well, exactly. So he learned, languages, theology, chivalry, and it was also a place where he was safe. It was still, as the son of Henry VII, he was, people didn't always want him to be safe. And yet it was this wonderful situation, not far from London, but much safer than London, where he could have a childhood as well. He could play outside. He could do his jousting and all sorts of things. And actually, we will talk about the gardens at Eltham later, because the gardens are a very important part, and always have been. The outside space at Eltham has always been very important to the palace. So really, Henry VIII is when Henry VIII's childhood, the future King of England, spent his childhood there. And that was really the last time it really was a significant royal residence. And after that, it kind of fell into decline.
Okay. So if it was so important to Henry VIII and he was brought up there and it had been this great place, why did it suddenly fall into decline?
Henry VIII wanted to build a new house, and so he built Hampton Court, amongst others.
Okay.
And basically, you only need so many palaces on the outskirts of London. And so Hampton Court is very similar situation-wise to Eltham, but possibly more expansive and beautiful, I think, in terms of its situation on the Thames. But it meant that, I suppose, if you're based in London, based at St. James's Palace during the week, for example, you only really need one sort of weekend villa, I suppose, to speak, one sort of weekend pleasure palace on the outskirts of London. And so Hampton Court took precedence, and it meant that Eltham sort of fell into, I suppose, disrepair over time. I think Henry VIII wanted a new big blingy thing that he had built himself. He didn't want something that had medieval bits to it. He wanted a proper Tudor palace.
But wasn't it Cardinal Wolsey, not Henry VIII, who basically?
Well, yeah, well, that's the point. Cardinal Wolsey built it, and then Henry VIII got jealous, and so took it off him.
And nicked it. So that's actually why it's good. It's good because it got built by Wolsey, not Henry VIII. Yeah. Cardinal Wolsey was much more cultured.
Nonsuch was built by Henry VIII, though, wasn't it?
Well, I don't know really very much about Nonsuch.
No.
Okay, that's why it's so ugly. I hate Nonsuch. Awful place. Never go there. It was knocked down. Good riddance. Anyway, so the monarchy has basically dropped its toy and gone on somewhere else.
Yeah.
So what happens to Eltham then? It must have a bit of a kind of down and out period.
It does. So it was still sort of quite symbolic because of its history as a sort of seat of power in the medieval era. It remained sort of symbolic in the national consciousness, but it really began to decline from the reign of Elizabeth I onwards. So again, it was seen as outdated. It was seen as stuffy and dark and old compared to the more fashionable palaces and residences like Hampton Court, amongst others. And so it then, through James I and Charles I, we saw a succession of monarchs who wanted the latest trends. And in those days, it wasn't fashionable either to add on to or extend older palaces. It was fashionable to have a new shiny toy that was brand new. And so that's why we saw so many of the great Elizabethan and Jacobean houses aren't sort of additions to medieval houses. You look at somewhere like Longleat or Burley or others, they were built as brand new, shiny toys, really. And so it's interesting. Whereas, later it became fashionable to sort of extend or adjust historic houses. Whereas during that period, the sort of the Elizabethan, Jacobean, Carolean era, it was very fashionable to just demolish what was on the site or find a fresh site and just build something brand new. And so really it was, under those monarchs, the palace just continued to be left to sort of decay. It sort of just stayed empty, got dusty. And then during the English Civil War, it suffered particularly badly because it was seized by parliamentary forces. The Roundheads seized Eltham as, it was quite a symbolic taking of a royal palace taken by Cromwell's troops, and they actually dismantled significant parts of the palace. So they took bits of the roof off, they took some of the stone away, and that then sort of accelerated the decay of the palace.
What you would do if you took the wall off? I mean, poor old
all the roof off. Yeah, exactly.
The roof off. Well, do you feel proud of yourself, Geoff? I mean, you are, after all, descended from Roundheads. So do you feel
well, I don't know if I'm descended, but I'm a modern day Roundhead. I'm very much a modern day Puritan, aren't I, Rory?
I'm a louche cavalier, everyone. Anyway,
maybe another podcast on the Cavaliers and the Roundheads.
That would be really funny. We should get hats.
It would be better than Restor's politics,
Much better. I'll have a big feather, and you can have a kind of helmet that you kind of get muffled through.
I have a really dour, floppy felt black cap.
That would be great. Just keep spouting verse at me. I know what you're talking about. Okay, good. So the roof's been taken off. It's not looking good.
Mate.
The Cavaliers are licking their wounds. And then, I mean, like, we don't even have an 18th century question. Presumably nothing happens in the 18th century.
No, so actually by the 18th century it was a farmstead. So
the
restoration of the monarchy, Charles II comes back to the throne, and it is no longer deemed a suitable royal residence at all. And so they don't even keep it in royal hands. It still belonged to the crown and actually still does, but it was leased to a local farmer, and it was used as a farmhouse, a farmstead. And the palace was surrounded by agricultural buildings. I suspect the Great Hall itself was probably filled with a barn, really.
Yeah. So it's treated as a casualty of the Civil War, basically.
Yeah, and really it carries on like that for the 18th and 19th centuries, and so that's why there's a very little history. It was sort of a parochial farmstead for.
That must have been so romantic, though. Can you imagine?
Having a medieval barn with a hammer beam roof.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been amazing.
Extraordinary. Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. So now let's pivot to the great moment. So in the 1930s, a couple fall in love with it and they do something radical. Talk to me about that.
Yes, so it's Stephen and Virginia Courtauld. Were the couple in question, and they were. Well, Stephen Courtauld was from a great, wealthy merchant family, the Courtauld family, who made their fortune in textiles. And our
Forgive me
listeners,
for interrupting, but are they the same family who did the Courtauld University here in London?
yeah. So I was about to say, yeah,
Oh,
our listeners
sorry.
should be aware that that sort of the best sort of university in England to study sort of history of art, history of architecture, anything related to sort of art, fine art degrees or whatever, is the Courtauld Institute, which actually has its headquarters in Somerset House on the banks of the Thames. I mean, the most extraordinary palace on the banks of the Thames. And the Courtauld really is, I mean, it's one of the leading institutions in the history of art world, really, isn't it? And that was founded with an endowment from the Courtauld family. So they were great philanthropists. They were sort of for the
Mellons,
early
Paul
20th
Mellon.
century, they were the Mellons or I suppose, I don't know, the Rockefellers or the Astors of their day, but very philanthropic, gave money to all sorts of causes, patrons of the arts, particularly patrons of the arts. And
a bit like the Guinnesses from last week, actually.
Guinnesses, yeah, very similar to the Guinnesses, actually. Yeah. And actually, that's a good example because the Guinnesses bought Kenwood as their sort of weekend palace, which they then filled with art and then gave to the nation. So it's similar sort of vibe. And so Stephen was from this wealthy merchant family, textile family, and Virginia, his wife, was a sort of cosmopolitan socialite. And what they wanted in the 1930s, when they were sort of, this is sort of, I suppose, that sort of peak interwar period when, the end of the Depression, but people were still, there was still a lot of money sloshing around.
Roaring 20s, yeah.
Sort of tail end of the Roaring 20s. They wanted a house, really, that had historical character and modern luxury. And this is the ongoing thing that everyone wants. Everyone wants a house that has character and the latest luxuries. And, these days it's hard to create or find those because of all the listing statuses and all that. And the Courtaulds are very blessed that there wasn't a listing system in place in the 1930s, and they could pretty much do what they wanted. So they found this site, these romantic ruins on the outskirts of London, the ruins of Eltham Palace, and they just thought it was the most extraordinary site. Literally a stone's throw from London, yet it felt like you're in the middle of the countryside. This extraordinary medieval barn, as it was then, great hall with the hammer beam roof, and they could see what they could create. And so what they did is they took a lease from the Crown. The Crown still owned the freehold and still does own the freehold of the palace. And they took a 99-year lease from the Crown in 1933, and they commissioned really the most extraordinary building project, a residential building project, probably of the 1930s. I think it's safe to say. And really their vision was to create a hybrid, a blend of the latest architectural styles, which we'll talk about, whilst also they restored the Great Hall sympathetically to its history, and also installed the latest technologies. And it was a sort of growing trend amongst wealthy, the new wealthy class in the early 20th century it was finally becoming fashionable to adapt historic houses to 21st century living. So it was no longer, the Victorians so often knocked down historic houses and built Victorian piles, whereas by the sort of 20th century, it was people wanted to sort of maintain that historical significance, but update. And that's what the Courtaulds successfully did.
It's funny, isn't it? Because with the 1920s and 30s, one tends to think of it as a time of knocking things down and building very modernist things. You don't tend to think of it as a time of kind of heritage creation. So how interesting that they am I wrong in thinking that, or were they unusual?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I suppose I don't know why there was sort of this desire to that's interesting. It's interesting because the we then see the 1950s and 60s where there's the great destruction of the English country house, and no one really cares about our heritage.
Yeah.
And so it's strange that sort of pre-Second World War there was still sort of this fascination with it, and I wonder if it's sort of if the sort of Second World War killed any sense, was so hard to live through, and we'll talk about this later because of the Courtauld's own experience in that time, but that it made almost everything sort of pale in comparison. I suppose, moving back into a house after the Second World War, and all the sons of that family have been killed, and whatever. I suppose it makes you think, well, what's the point of this big old pile? It's sort of big questions like life and death sometimes can make you sort of think, well, actually preserving this house is a bit insignificant compared to, what we've lost in the last 5 years, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there was definitely a sense of so much horror had been experienced. They wanted to create a kind of brave new world that didn't remind them of the past. But I something I've noticed about kind of 1920s and 30s design, especially in the UK, is how they do incorporate, especially Baroque elements. Actually, they seem very keen on the Baroque. But it's a very specific take. It's very stylized. It's quite sort of spiky. It's sort of it's very sort of, how do I put it? It's very dramatic, but simultaneously quite clean and neat. And in a funny old way, the hall at Eltham is that. It's a very dramatic, elaborate space that's simultaneously quite clean, quite angular, which would appeal to the aesthetic of the time. I'm just going to tweak my curtain because you see I'm getting fried in the window.
Yes. Well, I'll just sort of jump in there, Rory, because I think the Courtaulds, we need to give a bit of context. They're a fascinating family because they were great industrial revolutionists. They made their fortune. So I think the founder of the family company was Samuel Courtauld. Samuel Courtauld was this Huguenot descent. So we've talked a bit about Huguenots. We've talked about
we love a Huguenot.
Yeah, the sort of the Protestant refugees who fled to the Netherlands amongst other places, and a lot of them ended up in East Anglia because it was the easiest place to come across. So we've talked in the past, I think, about the Huguenots in Norfolk and Suffolk and Essex, and the Dutch gables you see in those counties. And unsurprisingly, the Courtaulds ended up in Essex and they were Huguenot Protestants, and they ended up setting up this textile mill that became Courtaulds, it was called, and it became the world's largest textile company. And what's interesting is, you have this sort of different generations. So that first generation, Samuel Courtauld the elder, was sort of the great entrepreneur. And sort of 2 generations later, you get his great nephews, Samuel again and Stephen, and they were the philanthropists. So sort of the family had now made the money over 2 generations. Now the third generation wanted to give all the money away. And so Samuel Courtauld was the art collector who founded the Courtauld Institute. And it really was founded through giving his collection and lots of money to the Institute upon his death. And he donated all sorts of extraordinary paintings. And it was his brother, was Stephen, who was also a philanthropist, who was the one who built Eltham with Virginia. So really, it is interesting how you get these families, often the first generation makes the wealth, the second sort of build on it, and then the third generation sort of sits on it and thinks, well, you need to either spend it or give it away, sort of thing. And that was certainly the case with the Courtaulds. So we end up with them commissioning this extraordinary building, and that takes us back to my opening quote, that letter in the Times, because they employed not 1 but 3 architects to build this extraordinary Art Deco house.
So can you describe to me how they blended the Art Deco with the medieval?
I suppose what they did is they kept the Great Hall really as it was. So Art Deco, I suppose for context, Art Deco was sort of a short-lived period in architectural history between the First and Second World Wars. Our listeners will be familiar with it because they're so famous on the screen. These great Art Deco hotels that Poirot would visit or whatever.
Agatha Christie.
How would you describe Art Deco in general? It was sort of early modernism, really, wasn't it? But sort of.
It's weird. It's weird. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but to me, it's kind of it's where Art Nouveau from before the First World War, which is very florid, and almost postmodern in its tone meets with modernism and
Mm.
becomes quite geometric, but still quite elaborate.
Yeah, exactly. Geometric is a good word. Very sort of sleek, quite angular, often quite plain, and at the same time, plain in terms of often whitewashed or white rendered walls, but then at the same time, quite intricate.
But in the same way, I mean, the Empire State Building is Art Deco, and you think that like the sort of we all know what a skyscraper.
The great cruise liners of the sort of mid or early 20th century had sort of Art Deco.
Yeah, the kind of the QE, was it the Queen Mary, whatever it was?
Yeah, exactly.
Am I thinking, is the Empire State Building right? Or am I thinking of the Chrysler Building? I always muddle them up.
I'm not. One's Art Nouveau and one's Art Deco, but yeah, I think Empire State is Art Deco.
The reason I'm saying it is because listeners will be familiar with those buildings, the really famous ones in New York, but we all know what a skyscraper looks like. They can be very, very plain.
Yeah, the Chrysler Building is Art Deco. Yeah.
So the Chrysler Building is simultaneously modern, but also has very distinctive elements that make it quite decorative, and that really characterizes this style.
Yeah.
It's a way of
it also drew on the sort of Egyptian architecture as well and stuff like that, didn't it? It was sort of and we'll talk more about that. But anyway, so in terms of the blend they created, it was quite sort of pioneering for its time. It was sort of a hybrid. Stephen and Virginia Courtauld were very involved with the process of the build, and they were also quite progressive. So they wanted to honor that history, but at the same time have the best cutting edge technology and tastes and designs. And so what they did is they knocked down some bits of the building that they thought were insignificant or got in the way of their own plans, but they did recognize this historic significance of the Great Hall. And so they preserved it. They not only preserved it, they renovated it very well. For the 1930s, they didn't take shortcuts. They did it properly. And yet sort of between these medieval bits, they sort of created this vast Art Deco complex that sort of linked everything together. And that's what the chap who wrote the letter I read at the start referred to as the sort of cigarette factory.
Which is very uncharitable, I think.
I think it is too. I mean, I can see it. Art Deco is because so many of the great buildings, the great state or civic buildings, were Art Deco. It's sort of slightly chicken and egg. Where do we associate Art Deco with civic buildings because we see the architectural style so much in civic buildings, rather than because it actually is in itself a sort of industrial or civic style. And I think you look at so what's interesting with so Eltham Palace, really, I mean, what's interesting is for Art Deco, there are elements, Rory, I think, with Art Deco. It reminds me a bit of sort of Keble College in Oxford, in the sense that the outside, so it's not unlike sort of the Art Deco buildings you might imagine in Agatha Christie adaptations, which are all sort of rendered in white with big plate glass. Eltham is red brick with a lot of stone dressing, so it's it's actually sort of stripy, and that's why it reminds you of Keble. Keble is a great Victorian Gothic pile in Oxford college in Oxford, built by Butterworth. But it has that sort of red brick with stripes of stone. Well, Keble, it's actually stripes of brick, whereas at Eltham you've got these stripes of stone.
And a slightly French mansard looking
over the entrance section. Entrance tower, there's this very French looking mansard roof,
almost like Waddesdon. It's curious.
It's sort of butterfly shaped, the house. So it's sort of, you've got this again, Waddesdon's sort of vibe. You've got this sort of chateau-esque tower in the middle with the door, and above that a Palladian window, and then these sort of flanking bits that sort of jut out at an angle on either side, like butterflies' wings. It is. So in terms of sort of the style, I suppose you would describe Eltham as a sort of fusion of Art Deco and medieval, which is a very strange fusion. And again, like you mentioned, Rory, it's sort of the characterizing features are the geometric shapes, the streamlined forms, but also because world and global travel was much easier, there was also a lot of exotic materials and modern technology that we use, and we'll get into the sort of the woods and the marbles that we use in the inside.
Yeah,
but the aesthetic, I suppose, through the so the residential wing of the palace was designed by a firm called Seeley and Paget, and what's interesting is the exterior is that balance of medieval and modern. So the use of the stone. So there's still the original stone bridge over the moat was kept intact. But then what you had is, again, the stone was carried in from the stone bridge. It was carried into the stripes, but in a much more contemporary way. And really, the whole design was made to try and complement the medieval aspects of
I think it does, because the reason I was looking on my phone is I was Googling the thing and having a quick look to remind myself. And at first glance, actually, you can't quite work out which is which. You have to look quite hard to work out which is the modern bit and which is the medieval bit. So I think it's quite effective. I think it's quite effective.
I agree.
You can't quite tell. It all meshes, and then you have I think the cigarette factory comment. I mean, I don't know what cigarette factories he was looking at, but I mean, I'd love to see them because they must be great.
Yeah. No, it's extraordinary. And there are sort of two wonderful entrances, because there's the one side which is that sort of the sort of mansard roof and the tower, and then there's the other side as it sort of spans out, like if you imagine butterfly's wings.
Yeah.
As it juts out, then the other side sort of, as this sort of V shape opens up, then it's connected by this wonderful curved stone sort of colonnade, which is very sort of Renaissance-esque, I would say, with sort of wonderful balustrading and Ionic columns. So so it was so there were elements of the stone dressings and the red brick were partly inspired by Hampton Court, and then you have this colonnade that links the two flanking sort of wings of the house, and these are then flanked by pavilions. But again, you see this strange thing of it looking very sleek and contemporary, but also a lot of detail, a lot of
well, let's on this. I mean, let's on the sleekness. I think what's so striking to me about Eltham is you get the outside, which is this slightly strange fusion of medieval and, I suppose, what do you want to call it? I don't know, Tudor, with classical elements. And then you go inside and you enter that basement section, which is the most famous part of all, which is the most modern bit. So shall we talk about that now?
Let's talk about that. So that is so
it's a sort of saloon, right?
It is. It's so what the room Rory is referring to is a room that I suppose most of our listeners and followers will be familiar with, but perhaps don't realize it's from Eltham. It's this sort of extraordinary circular entrance hall.
It's been in so many films. I mean, because there isn't that much Art Deco stuff, it gets used a lot.
Yeah. And it's the entrance hall. It was created by a Swedish designer, one of these many different people who the Courtauld brought in, called Rolf Engströmer. And it's
even more.
It's brilliant. And it's this extraordinary, circular sort of room with these sort of marquetry, sort of inlaid panels around the walls, aren't they? So like it's sort of a veneer, exactly, and
a white ceiling with a. Has it got a little domey situation?
Exactly. So there's this. So I mean, it is sort of come in, and it's sort of this veneered. There's this extraordinary dome which is sort of made of I think sort of built of glass bricks, I suppose, a sort of top-lit circular dome, and then directly under that is this circular rug, sort of with very geometric contemporary,
very 1930s
patterns, and then curving sofas and tub chairs, so they all fit within the rug like sort of big, lovely, all rounded. And then you look back at the entrance with these sort of curving walls that come out, which are beautifully inlaid with these Roman soldiers. Well, it's not a Roman, it's a Viking on the side. It's a Viking standing opposite a Roman soldier. And it's black bean veneer decorated with marquetry.
Yeah.
And then so there's the Viking and the Roman soldier, and then there are background scenes from Italy and Scandinavia. Slightly random combination, I suppose. The Swedish designer Rolf wanted to use that, and then again you have walnut and black bean are the woods used. So again, they carries through to the black bean in the legs of the chairs and the sofas and the walnut tables. Very, extraordinary. And then what's wonderful is within this circular entrance hall, you have these sort of almost cruise ship like recessed stairs that sort of rise up into the wall on either side.
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary, and
I remember that when I visited. It was God, it's amazing. It's such a hypnotic space, actually. I'm looking at it now, you get drawn into it. It's so weird, but very beautiful. Very beautiful, very understated, but not too minimalist. Just amazing, really.
yeah.
Crazy.
And what's interesting is, again, you see the sort of, the Courtaulds were themselves, great travelers, and we'll talk a bit about that later. But they wanted, and the beauty of 1930s with trains and cruise ships and so forth is it was the golden age of travel in some ways, and so they were able to import the finest materials from around the world. And so you had the black bean and the walnut inlaid veneers, but then you had Italian marble on the floor. And now the Italian marble floor, actually, you can't see it because
it looks like lino. I didn't realize it was marble.
Well, no, but what you can't see because of the circular rug is there's actually a sunburst sort of pattern in marble on the floor. So it sort of bursts out like the sun from the center of the room in Italian marble that was shipped over, and really what the Courtaulds wanted to create here was an absolute sort of wow, sort of overwhelmingly extraordinary space as you walked into the house.
It's just a hall, is it?
This is the entrance hall, yeah. But what with the marble floor with the sunburst pattern under the rug. But what's so extraordinary? It really is. I mean, it must have just overwhelmed guests and visitors when they entered those doors. But what I think is so interesting is they were absolutely committed to creating something that was both super sleek, sort of chic, elegant, and modern, yet also grand and of a grand scale. And
yes,
I think they managed to do that pretty impressively, certainly in that entrance hall.
I think the marquetry is what makes it, because it is a very modern, sleek space. Smooth is the word that comes to mind, and yet the marquetry just gives it that little zing, little lift that kind of makes it a bit French, a bit European. It kind of makes it, it's hinting at chinoiserie and all that kind of thing, and it just reminds you that you're actually in quite an old building. It's very, very clever design, but that's not the only modern element in the building.
No,
is it,
I mean, there's so many wonderful rooms. So each room, as you go through the palace, each room was sort of tailored really to reflect the personalities of Stephen and Virginia Courtauld. So they each had their sort of bits, and so it's a bit of a hodgepodge in some ways. I mean, it always has the sort of the golden threads that run through it are that combination of sleek modernity with historical craftsmanship and everything like that. But as you go through the house, sort of, so Virginia's bedroom is a particularly sort of it's a very indulgent space. You've got silk paneled walls, this extraordinary ensuite bathroom with a sunken bathtub and these gold mosaic tiles.
Gold mosaics in your bathroom, that's not bad.
Extraordinary. And the sunken bathtub as well was incredibly sort of ultra modern in the 1930s, proper, running piped water. And we can talk we'll talk a bit more about some of the modern sort of latest mod cons they incorporated in the house. But what's interesting is the contrast between Virginia's incredibly sort of indulgent bedroom and bathroom with Stephen's bedroom, which was more masculine and sort of understated. So it's sort of, you've got a lot of polished wood. It's quite functional. It's quite simple. Yeah, quite blokey, I suppose, in contrast with Virginia's room. But then again, even then, we see all these extraordinary mod cons being incorporated. So these the private quarters where they sort of had their bedrooms, they had underfloor heating, which was pioneering at the time, built-in speakers, and even a centralized vacuum system. So sort of vacuums built into the walls where you sort of went into a room and the maid would plug a pipe into the wall and it would suck. You could, vacuum the room and then go to next. I mean, extraordinary.
So I don't understand vacuum. What do you mean vacuum the room?
Centralized vacuum system. So there was a vacuum system built into the walls. So a suction system whereby rather than carrying around a vacuum cleaner, you would go into a room, connect the pipe to the wall to a little hole in the wall, and it would then suck all the dust up into the wall and then go through into a giant bin bag. I don't know. I mean, really, really clever.
That is very. I thought you were talking about vacuumers and kind of making the rooms sound tight. Or
No,
something.
not vacuous. Yeah, no, a super contemporary vacuum cleaning system. I mean, really, some of the stuff they incorporated really was sort of, I suppose it's the sort of thing where you almost imagine today, what could you have if, something so out of the blue. But I suppose, like, when you think about some of these technologies like that glass, where you press a button and it becomes frosted, and then you press a button and it becomes clear again. Things which you almost imagine couldn't exist, and then you throw enough money at it and it can exist. It's almost like that with the Courtaulds. They sort of thought, what could we have in this house that if we throw enough money at it can be invented? And then they just did it.
Bordering on silliness, I think.
Exactly.
So
we need to go through to some of the other rooms, because that Art Deco theme just carries on.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you about Mahjong. Actually, can you tell me about that?
Ah, yes. Let's talk about Mahjong. Absolutely. So Mahjong was the Courtauld's pet. Mahjong, or Jongy, as he was known, was a ring-tailed lemur.
Oh my God.
And he was bought, surprise, surprise, at the Harrods pet department, like so many of these great pets.
Sake.
So Virginia went to Harrods and bought a ring-tailed lemur, and he lived with the Courtaulds for 15 years.
Did he molt? Is that why they had the central vacuum system?
Well, it gets better. So he would travel with them on their travels. He moved houses with them, and he died at Eltham Palace in 1938. But when he lived at Eltham Palace for those few years after it was completed, he had his own bedroom,
right?
And it was also central heated. It had its own underfloor heating, as he deserved, as his ring-tailed lemur deserved. He had a bedroom with a underfloor heating, and he was absolutely pampered. I mean, he even had, so to get to his little room, there was a bamboo ladder that was created that linked his little bedroom with its own underfloor heating to the rest of the house, and he basically had the run of the house. I mean, just the most bizarre.
Did they have kids?
Creature. I don't think they did have kids, and I can say that because my family knew them in Zimbabwe, and I don't think they had any children. I think
there was a bit of projecting onto this lemur then.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of projections.
But as we will now see, the death of their pet lemur initiated World War II,
which did.
The following year. So terrible moments in international relations. How did this shimmering world that we've described come crashing down in World War II?
So, yeah. I mean, actually, it's funny you should say that the death of the lemur during World War II. It's in some ways those 2 years from 1936, the completion of the house, through to 1938, the death of Mahjong and the start of World War II, were sort of the only real golden years for the Courtaulds at this house.
Yeah, well, they didn't have very long, did they? I didn't realize.
Wonderful years with their pet lemur, and then the pet lemur died, and World War II broke out, and the house was requisitioned, and they never moved back really. And we'll talk about that because it's a great shame. I just have to quickly touch on a couple of the other extraordinary rooms. So there was.
Oh yeah, sorry.
The dining room is this amazing Art Deco room, again with this sort of staggered ceiling. Again, Zebrano wood paneling. I don't know where Zebrano wood is from, but Zebrano wood chrome finishes, and a glass dining table, which again was very.
I love the 1930s obsession with chrome. It just is.
I know, isn't it brilliant? I know.
It's like what's that? It's like Del Monte. They love sort of glittery, shiny things.
Exactly right. And then there was also quite a cool room called the map room. Which was actually Stephen Courtauld's study, but he called it the map room because it had these large this enormous hand-painted world map on the wall.
Amazing.
And then beneath that, in the basement, was this sort of dark room for Virginia, who was a photographer. And so it was really, I mean, I don't know how many bedrooms they had, but they didn't need many because it was just them and their lemur who lived there. And so they had all these, they basically used the space to create all that sort of, I suppose it's a bit like someone today having a house in London that has the home cinema and the golf simulator and the swimming pool in the basement and the gym and the whatever. It's sort of every sort of folly you could want sort of just plumbed in or built into the house. They were sort of the early versions of that. And so, yeah, and so this house was finished in 1936. And they had these wonderful 2 years, 36 to 38, and then their lemur died, and then World War II broke out, and really, it had a significant impact on the palace, and really soured their relationship with the property, which I think is really sad because they had
What was
invested
it requisitioned for?
So it was well, it was requisitioned a bit later. The first thing that happened was it was actually damaged by the Blitz. So it was during the London Blitz when the German Luftwaffe were doing air raids on London. Eltham Palace wasn't a target because it wasn't close to London, and it wasn't directly bombed, but several bombs fell in the grounds, and this caused structural damage to the house and to the surrounding buildings and garden rooms. And really, it sort of shattered the Courtauld's sort of little bubble that they were living in. So they had become accustomed to this extraordinary life of comfort that they had created in this pleasure palace in Eltham, and suddenly the sort of harsh realities of war, the idea that this beautiful building could be destroyed at any moment, all the shortages, the rationing and all of that sort of stuff. It really it really brought them to earth with a bump. And they suddenly realized how I suppose how delicate this building was, and that it could at any point a bomb could land in it and destroy it.
Yeah.
And it was also then, as the war progressed, that it wasn't fully requisitioned, but it was partly requisitioned for the war effort. And it was used, bits of the estate were used to house military personnel, and it was they used the government used bits for sort of planning defense activities and stuff like that. But the Courtauld still lived there, and so it wasn't fully requisitioned, and that probably made it harder because again, there's these rooms like the entrance hall, which once they would be hosting the great and the good of British high society in, was suddenly it was their home, but they were sharing it with these random soldiers and officers. And it must, in many ways, it would have been easier, like so many of the great country houses, to have sort of just moved out completely and let it be sort of to live there during a time of semi-requisitioning must be particularly hard because again, if you've got this extraordinary, this extraordinary sort of marquetry inlay, and there's sort of some soldier is pinning up maps of, army maneuvers with drawing pins on this walnut veneer. It's sort of, if you're not living there, you don't know, and you just come back and see it and restore it. But if you're living there, it's a bit like someone sort of having someone to stay and fussing over where you put your glass and make sure you use a coaster and that sort of thing.
I should say coasters. It's a bad thing and lots of friends will get cross with me for saying this, but coasters really irritate me. I get so annoyed.
Rory, so do I. I know.
Okay, well, we can merrily go around creating rings.
Something we agree on, Rory.
Sorry?
Something we agree on.
Oh, great! Hooray! The important issues. I have to say, I don't have much sympathy for the Courtaulds. Frankly, I think that everyone had to pull their weight, and they had this massive house, and the lemur was dead. So there was more. The cage was free.
Well, and also they lost their servants because all the servants were called in to do military service. So suddenly they were rambling around this big old house, sharing it with a bunch of soldiers, and didn't have their maids or handymen because they were all serving in the war effort. I mean, I know you don't
need them. They've got the automated vacuum system.
That's true. That's true. But really, it sort of soured the whole relationship, and that's sort of where we move on to, Rory, which is sort of their departure in 1944, where they decided to leave the house for good. And in fact, they became so disillusioned not only with Eltham but with England in general that they actually moved to a different hemisphere. They moved to southern Rhodesia, as was now Zimbabwe. And that's where my family knew them from, because as our listeners will be aware from past episodes, I lived in Africa until I was 6, and my family lived in Zimbabwe. And the Courtaulds were part of a large group of sort of, I suppose, British high society people who moved out there after the Second World War. And they built this extraordinary house again. They were great patrons. They built this wonderful house called La Rochelle, which is now a hotel. But again, their gardens were their big thing. So Stephen had created this extraordinary garden at Eltham, and then he created a sort of subtropical botanic garden at La Rochelle in Zimbabwe. But it was interesting that they were so pained by their experience during the Second World War, that everything they treasured, everything they put their hopes and dreams on, this society they'd invested so much in the 1930s was just all brought tumbling down, that they couldn't bear to live amongst the ruins, I suppose.
Yeah, I have a bit more sympathy now. I think if they left the UK, that makes a bit more sense. I mean, post-war England.
It shows just how emotionally invested people can be in these projects. Like, ultimately they still had lots of money. They could have easily restored the house. They could have easily done so many, but they were so emotionally invested in this sort of baby of theirs that they just had to cut ties and cut loose from it completely.
But I think it was also a broader symptom of England at the time. I mean, they were very sophisticated people, and England in the late 40s was pretty depressing.
Yeah.
I mean, the country was bankrupt. There were still shortages of everything. They just moved into the Labour kind of Clement Attlee situation, which was probably not a very comfortable place to be if you were extremely rich.
Yeah.
I think they found it. I think a lot of people found it quite. If you were part of the fast-moving high society set in between the wars, post-war England, I think was quite dour.
Yeah, agreed. And it's interesting because we talk about the semi-requisitioning during the war. After the Courtaulds left in 1944, the house was, I suppose, fully requisitioned. It was taken over by the Army's Royal Army Educational Corps, and they used it
famous aesthetes.
They used it as a training facility right up until the 1990s. I mean, it was just
really?
You just imagine this, even in the 70s and 80s, this extraordinary Art Deco house just being used to train, educate soldiers, I suppose.
That's one of the lovely things about England, or the UK more generally, though, isn't it? That, you often, because we're so lucky and we have so much built history here, you often go to, I don't know, you go to get I mean, I wouldn't say get your passport stamped, but you'll go to some institution. I can't think of an example right now, something or other, some lecture at some event, and you'll come across an incredible building, which have the use of, which has sat there sort of pickled in time, not really been changed since, I don't know, it was made over, whenever it was. And it's incredible. You just find yourself endlessly walking through these time capsules.
Yeah, it's true. And I always find it interesting. I mean, you go to even houses today, and exactly there are little nods to its previous uses. I was at a country house last week, and they've still got the 1950s lino floor in the laundry room, and even though they've restored the whole of the house,
quite fashionable again. Lino.
Well, they just thought, I know, and carpeted bathrooms. That's another one that country houses love. A good carpeted bath, and showers are a no-go for a lot of historic house owners. But
I have to say, I love showers. I'm so excited about a shower. They're good, aren't they?
Absolutely, they're brilliant. So right up to the 1990s, it was sort of neglected, used, it fell into disrepair, but was used by this Army Educational Corps. And then in the 1990s, English Heritage, which is, for our listeners who aren't aware, it's sort of like the National Trust. It's sort of a heritage organization, sort of funded by the government, that looks after historic buildings. Usually what you find is English Heritage looks after sort of historic castles, and the National Trust looks after historic homes, houses. But Eltham is sort of an exception. It is a sort of, but I suppose it has that medieval aspect to it. But English Heritage took over, so it's still the Crown still owns the freehold, but English Heritage took control of management in 1995 because they recognised its architectural and historical significance as sort of one of the great examples of Art Deco architecture, plus this medieval Great Hall. And they began this extensive program of renovation that really restored Eltham to basically its former glory.
And was it made over with an endowment? And did it have to have an endowment for it to, or was it different because it was part of the Crown freehold?
Yeah, I know. I don't think there was one specific. The Courtaulds didn't make it over to English Heritage. They sort of allowed their lease to lapse, and that was it. I think it was when it was made over by it was sort of the government owned the lease, I suppose, as an Army Corps educational facility, and then the government would have made it over to English Heritage, and so I doubt it came with one specific sort of donation or endowment, and so they would have probably had to do a lot of fundraising, but they did, I think, manage to restore it pretty impressively. I mean, you've been quite recent. When did you last go to Eltham, Rory?
Well, funnily enough, I actually went. I went years ago. It was just so vivid in my mind. I went when I was doing an internship for English Heritage when I left school. That was my experience. But I just remember it. I mean, it's so clear in my mind.
And I think George, the chap who George Young, who wrote that letter to the Times that I started with, I think it probably wasn't entirely fair. I think in terms of his rather rude description, because I think it is. Yeah, I think it is.
I can see where it's coming from. I think the interiors are better than the exteriors. In all truth, but I still think, given that it's one of the most daring and remarkable Art Deco fragments left in the UK, it's probably not aged terribly well, that letter, as many letters to the Times don't.
Yeah, and I suppose that's I suppose a good way to close is sort of what was the. I mean, there was a wonderful 2-part article in Country Life back in the 1930s on Eltham Hall, part 1 and part 2, the residence of Mr. Stephen Courtauld, and it was again, it would have been quite unusual for Country Life to feature a brand new house in the 1930s, but it was so exceptional that they did. But I think I suppose to close, how it did divide opinion, and probably still does. I think Art Deco architecture does divide opinion. It's got, I think, Gillian Morey, who was a writer, she wrote that it has a Hollywood atmosphere, but also that it was sort of romantic and I suppose a charming, if rather conventional, formal style, which in no way reflects the extraordinary interior. So she writes about the sort of relatively plain Art Deco exterior that sort of belies this extraordinary interior, and I think that's really, really what it is. And I would love to see. I mean, I do still find that Art Deco, there is a romantic aspect to it, isn't there? When you think about what do you associate with Art Deco, you associate it with sort of, swing music and, cocktails at a hotel bar with palm trees and in pots. And, there's a vision you picture when you think of sort of the 1930s. And this room sort of encapsulates, the entrance hall sort of encapsulates in one room sort of what you imagine of that sort of 1930s roaring 20s.
I just think of it as I don't think of it as romantic so much as incredibly chic, because it's a combination of something that's very pared back and quite minimalist, but with a couple of frills that make it attractive. And I think that's quite a good working definition of chic, and it's very alluring. I mean, whenever you think of a martini, right, you tend to think of the 1930s. That's the kind of peak martini cocktail zone. And there's nothing sort of more chic than a martini, really. It's the vodka with the little bit of with the brine, the olive, the twiddle, the thing that makes it a bit kind of special.
Yeah. And on that note, I think it's a good place to finish. So thank you, Rory. I think I've really enjoyed today's episode. It was quite.
Thank you, Geoff. That was great research there.
Art Deco house. Thank you to our lovely listeners and viewers on YouTube and followers and supporters for.
Yes, reminders to our listeners that if you want to see our lovely faces as we're talking away, you can do so now on YouTube.
You can, and hopefully we'll be doing more videos soon, not just of us sitting at our desks on our mics, but also visiting houses and so forth. Another reminder to our lovely listeners that you can book tickets now for the Country House Podcast live at Neville Holt Festival on the 13th of June. Please do book and come along. We'd love to see you there. We'd love to meet you there. And apart from that, please do tune in again next week. Thank you very much. And thank you, Rory.
Thank you. Bye-bye.